Yes, so as Betty said, I'm going to share with you today some of my work on financial viability of community forestry in Brazil. This is in part related to my PhD work, which I did with Karen. And I'll just say that, like Kara, I was working in South America, in Bolivia and Peru, when I decided to pursue graduate school, and was really happy to know that Karen Kiner, who I had known when I was an undergraduate at Florida and she was a graduate student, was working as a professor, and she invited me to go to Acre the summer of 2003 to kind of check things out. She also told me, that's great that you have experience in South America, but I'd really prefer that you work in Brazil. That's where I can be of most assistance to you, and I think you'd be interested in what's happening, especially in Acre. So I went. That's when I met Kara and some other folks that became fellow graduate students, and reconnected with Marianne and saw some other folks, and really got excited about what was happening there. I did get my PhD in 2010, and I'm now based in Berkeley with a consulting business called Green Value, where I work and provide services and research, training, and other types of support to promote and strengthen small-scale and community forest management around the globe. So I'll get started. The presentation today is going to include some background information, an overview of some of my work on financial analysis of community forest management across the Amazon region. The work I did as a graduate student in Brazil helped prepare me for work across the Amazon region, and then also allowed me to continue working in Brazil. And I'm going to provide two examples from work there. One on the Coomflona community timber production case that you all read about in the recent Win-Win article in Rural Development, and also a case study I implemented with a Brazilian community or consulting forester, Max Roncoleta, namely Babaçu palm nut collection, to provide kind of an example of another way that we've used or implemented financial analysis, and then some conclusions. So as background, from the late 1990s to about 2011, the Brazilian government, with some of its own funding, as well as funding from international governments and national and international NGOs, provided a lot of support to pilot community forest management timber projects in the Brazilian Amazon. These were seen as demonstration projects to see if community forest management could encourage or help support forest conservation and provide legal and sustainable supplies of timber, as well as support forest-based development. There were large investments in technical capacities of community members, especially with regards to forestry operations, but much less support for things like market research and business and financial management capabilities. One of the things that was promoted for these pilot projects, especially in Acre, was FSC certification. And because I had a background in certification, I decided for my master's to do research on the positive and negative impacts of certification for two associations in Acre implementing timber production. This was in 2004. And I found there was a diversity of types of benefits associated with certification, as well as with in some cases even more so with just forest management itself, especially with regards to infrastructure. That came up in some of the articles in the reading this week, especially for roads and things like health posts. And there was concern that when this support ended from the government, especially this funding and from NGOs, that communities would no longer be able to pay for certification or perhaps even cover the costs of forest operations with income from just the sale of timber products. So I decided to team with Dr. Thomas Holmes, a research economist at the U.S. Forest Service, and Gabriel Cury, who was finishing his master's and was working at Idazan in Brazil, to look at the financial viability of 3 pilot community forest management projects for timber in Amazonas and Pará states. And we did this work from 2005 to 2008. Tom and I developed a set of spreadsheets that we used to work with 2 of these initiatives. One was Coomflona, another was in Mamirawa, and we sat down with folks working directly with these initiatives and organized all the data they had on costs and income for one productive period. We went through it and analyzed it together. Gabriel had used a similar process in his work And we found that 2 of the initiatives were profitable. These were the 2 that Tom and I sat down and worked with. And one, which happened to be certified, was not. There was a lot of interest in these results because there were very few studies on the financial viability of community forest management initiatives. And there was a lot of interest in the participatory methodology and kind of simplified approach to financial analysis that Tom and I had used. So we decided to turn that into a tool that's now called the Green Value Tool for Simplified Financial Analysis. U.S. Forest Service international programs and USAID had supported the work that we did for my PhD, and they offered a grant to use the Green Value Tool to do trainings in 5 countries across the Amazon region to strengthen the financial viability of community forest management initiatives. And I led this work for 5 years at Earth Innovation Institute, working with a diversity of collaborators, producers, and different types of forest products and services. So I wanted to provide kind of an overview, of the types of products and services that we analyzed with the tool across the Amazon region. These analyses were done during 16 3-day workshops in which we would work with 15 to 18 people that were from government agencies, NGOs, and communities. And we work with them over the 3 days to analyze 2 to 4 different types of products and services. In all, we analyzed over 40 of these. So we did continue to look at timber products in various forms, but we also looked at diversity of non-timber forest products, environmental services, and even agricultural products towards the end of the project. So we looked at diverse things like artisan textiles, which use natural dyes from the forest, bamboo in various forms, Brazil nuts with different producers under different scenarios, some red projects, tourism, freshwater fishery examples, and then we looked at things like black pepper, chickens, and fruit pulp, and saw that really there were no limitations to the types of products and services we could use the tool with. So I'm not going to get into, the specific results from these analyses, especially since they were done usually in a workshop setting where we were looking at various types of products and services and couldn't really, and data accuracy was not the real goal. It was more training, teaching people how to use this tool, and getting an idea for the viability of the different types of products they were working with. The case of Coomflona is a bit different because we were focusing on them, and we have done some other case studies where we were really concerned about data accuracy. But in these general cases, what I can say is that we found that many of them were profitable. They were creating well-paying jobs and generating other benefits for communities, but still faced a lot of challenges, especially regarding financial management and bureaucracy, particularly in the case for timber. Generally, the timber initiatives that we looked at that were successful or viable had received significant initial support in getting going and operated for several years. There were exceptions to this, but some of the ones that we saw that were newer and didn't have as much experience were not profitable yet. And what we found with regards to non-timber forest products is that these were often analyzed at the family or individual level, and they were often not profitable when the value of labor was included, even in some cases where price supports were provided by the government. And so what we did was, when you have a family who's going out to the forest, for example, to collect Brazil nuts, they're often not thinking about the cost of their own time, the opportunity cost of their time. In some cases, there are very few opportunities to earn cash income, but we wanted to come up with a value of their labor and include that as a cost so that they could see at the end what the real cost of that, let's say lata or kilo of Brazil nuts was, so they could then compare that to prices that they're receiving and think about ways that they could reduce their costs or increase their income. There was a lot of interest in the results, especially regarding the viability of these different resource management models and the socioeconomic impacts of the enterprises, and a lot of interest on the part of governments and NGOs in the results in terms of implications for policies. And I don't really have time to get into that, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about implications so far. So now I'm going to share briefly the Coomflona example, which you all read about. This is a cooperative run by local residents. Its members live inside the Tapajos National Forest. They worked for over 20 years to obtain the right to manage the timber within the forest. Finally achieved that. Last count, they had 212 members from 21 communities. And in 2013, which was the last year of our analysis, they had 81 workers, including 34 permanent. And these were, all of the temporary workers were from the communities inside the Tapajos National Forest, and the large majority, there were few exceptions of permanent staff that were not from the communities there. And they were originally given an area of 33,691 hectares of a total area of 527,000 to manage for timber. Today, Coomflona is one of the few community forestry pilot projects still operating and working independently of those that originally received support under the government's Promanejo project or Floresta and Floresta project. And it's one of two cooperatives running large community forest management timber operations in the Brazilian Amazon. The other is Cooperative Floresta in Acre. So I wanted to briefly go through, you guys saw this graph, but just kind of remind you of the trajectory that Coomflona has been on. They started with their first harvest in 2005 and 2006 after a couple of years of preparation. And they did selective harvesting on 100 hectares and then increased that over the years up to 1,000 hectares in 2010. And each year, kind of the gap between the amount of timber that was approved for harvest and that which was actually harvested narrowed. And throughout this time, they were learning, getting more experience, overcoming hurdles. And we focused our financial analysis on the years 2007, 2011, and 2013. What we did was we had 3 workshops with Coomflona staff and partner organizations where, again, we together went through all the data, collected and organized it and analyzed it on cost and income. We organized costs by 5 major productive activities. Administration, this is something the Help Green Value tool helps you do. And we further organized costs by input type. So we were able to separate out and analyze labor costs, material and services costs, and those for machinery and equipment. And again, we looked at all costs related to production, including those that have been subsidized. So when we first did the analysis, in 2005, 2006, all the technical staff were subsidized, but we went ahead and included the costs as if the cooperative was paying for those. And the only things we didn't include were permanent subsidies such as stumpage. So the community had a non-onerous concession where they didn't, unlike industrial companies, they didn't have to pay the government to harvest the trees. And they also were receiving permanent help from the local university for doing inventories. And then together we reflected on the results and how to strengthen the viability of the operation in coming harvests. So what we found was that Coomflona went from being completely subsidized in our early analysis to being a very profitable and viable timber producer, in financial terms anyway. Profits increased dramatically, as we can see over the years. In 2007, it was about 11%, and that went up to about 92% in 2013. We saw that while this was happening, the volumes that were harvested were increasing, and there was learning by doing, something we emphasize in the article, which led to greater and greater labor efficiency. So that helped get the costs down and the variable costs down, and administration also became more efficient over time. What happened to the profits is that they went into the cooperative's general revenue stream and were used to support other activities. This is something really important for local residents, that the other examples, or these activities included carpentry shops, tourism and non-timber forest production, especially. They were trying to reactivate rubber tapping and help residents with the sale of rubber. And then at the end of the year, after all these costs, the overall profits of the cooperative were distributed among 5 different funds, including a health and education fund. We thought it was really interesting to look at total income being generated locally. So not just what was happening within the cooperative, but what were the impacts of what were the types of income that were being generated for local folks. So we looked at salaries and daily wages for field workers. These are costs for the cooperative for doing timber management, but also represent income to local people, which is an important benefit. These are direct benefits. And then we had even greater indirect benefits. So this includes, of course, profit, which, as I said, was used to support other activities for community members, but also the purchase of materials and services, which is income going to local businesses and residents as well. And this was quite significant, over $1.5 million for 2013. So again, from an initiative that was taking in substantial amounts of money to get going, it's turned into one that's now generating substantial benefits for local people and paying all of its costs. We were interested in looking then what do these wages and salaries look like for the average person, or on average for the workers. We found that full-time workers who are permanent were making on average per person about 3.2 times the legal minimum. So this was significant in that finding any kind of wage labor there is difficult. This is especially for community members who are living in remote areas within the National Forest. They have low education levels, usually not a lot of opportunities for cash income. They have an opportunity here, but not only an opportunity, but one that pays really well. And also for temporary workers, we found that on average, what each person made was about $3,408, which that was over a year, which would be 1.2 times the legal minimum for a year, but they were actually only working 4 to 8 months. So this was also a significant benefit. So in conclusion, again, the project financial support for the first 5 years was critical in letting Coomflona get on its feet in terms of learning, get administration down, developing relationships with NGOs and government agencies. And those relationships are still key to their success, is what they tell us. And Coomflona is unique in Brazil, but is an important demonstration of the potential for this type of model of a cooperative of community residents managing a concession within a national forest. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to include research on the impacts on livelihood at the family level, but that's something that would be really interesting for future research. So I'm going to quickly switch gears and go over an example of how we've used green value to look at financial viability of a different type of forest activity, the collection of Babaçu nuts in the state of Maranhão. Babaçu palm nut collection is a very important economic product for about 450,000 rural families in Brazil. There's a government price support for this, like there is for rubber, and I believe still for Brazil nuts. Though you all would know better than I. Also represented about 7% of the total value of non-timber forest product sales in 2015. So it's a substantial product. We looked at a typical family in Maranhão, Brazil. We did this research, Max Huncoletta and I, with ASEMA, which is an association there that provides technical assistance and has a relationship with a cooperative that buys the Babaçu nuts. We looked at the 2016-2017 harvest. This was a family that said that all of their cash income came from the sale of these Babaçu nuts. And typically the families are very dependent, who collect these nuts are very dependent on this income and live with high rates of poverty. This family consisted of 2 adults and 3 adolescent children who were all involved in one way or another in the collection, processing, and sale of the nuts. This family had access to 5 hectares of secondary forest and collected 10.72 tons of nuts during this season. And the products were the nuts themselves, the shells, and the charcoal. And we monitored labor and other inputs over 3 months, which was the main months of activity for this product. What we found is that the family was currently selling the nuts and a portion of the shells to intermediaries that were not providing receipts, and so they were not able to access the minimum legal price benefit, and they were using some shells to make charcoal for household use. 2 scenarios. One was kind of a business as usual, where they were continued to sell the nuts and shells to intermediaries, and then we looked at another scenario where they sold to a company or a cooperative that was able to provide a legal receipt and help them access the legal minimum price subsidy, which was 0.79 reais per kilo. And also where they were taking some of the shells and processing those into charcoal to sell. Unfortunately, what we found was the rate of return was negative for both scenarios, quite negative. What we found is that labor costs represented 90 to 92% of total costs. These were, it was exclusively hand labor. So opening the shells and it goes done with a machete. It was very labor intensive. And we were curious to see, well, gosh, if it's so negative, why are they doing this? And of course, what we found is they're not thinking about their labor costs and they have few other opportunities to earn income. And what we wanted to see was if we took out the labor costs and looked at the revenues that they are receiving minus other costs for some simple equipment and supplies that they have, and divided that by the number of days that they were working, where were they actually earning per day? So we found that this ranged from 12.69 reais per day for the business as usual scenario, and could go up to 30.31 reais if they were to actually access the subsidy for minimum price and also sell some of the shells as charcoal. This is less than the local rate of 50 reais per day, or the legal minimum of 39 per day, which they would receive if they were formally employed. But it was interesting to see that they could almost triple their income if they were to do these things like get receipts for their sales and process some of the shells into charcoal. So in this discussion, the point was not to say you're doing this wrong, but to generate discussion and ideas about what could they do to improve their income. And what we found regarding policy is that the legal minimum price is insufficient. The policy is designed to cover that gap between producers' costs and what the market is actually paying them. And we found that if we include labor costs, it's certainly not doing that. And we came up with ways that collectors could reduce labor costs with simple machinery for opening the nets, and again, improve income by adding some value and diversifying the products that they sell. And this was, again, also based on discussions with the family and with the association that was providing technical assistance, including more efficient ways to produce charcoal. So overall, there's a serious need for information on financial viability of different community forest management models and the socioeconomic benefits they generate, as well as the financial challenges that they face. So looking at inefficiencies, analyzing different scenarios, economies of scale are also really important. What can producers do to share costs among themselves to improve their economy of scale, and looking at things like infrastructure. What are the costs of transportation due often to poor road infrastructure? It's important for financial viability data that's generated to be considered in the development of policies and programs related to forest management and production. So how can this information be used to reduce bureaucracy or change policies? And what can be done to provide improved forest development related subsidies. We saw in one of the articles that they made the point, significant subsidies are going to agricultural producers, and it's much more than usually forest development related activities. And we found that definitely the enterprises and families that we worked with benefited from improved financial information. So a lot of gains could be made through improved monitoring and analysis. Sorry, the next door neighbors are mowing the lawn, working on the bushes. Bad timing. But we certainly saw people were really excited to have this information. They had never had this information before at their fingertips about their costs, especially when we broke it down to cost per unit sold, or seeing where their costs lie, if it's labor versus materials or services, et cetera. Hadn't thought before about the depreciation value of their machinery and equipment, so how much they need to be saving to replace those items in the future. So this is powerful information that can really, we hope, affect change, and we've seen some changes. We hope to continue collaborating with others to use green value for these purposes, so helping strengthen these production systems, helping improve policies and programs. And I want to say that collaboration was definitely key to all my work in Brazil and across the Amazon region for gaining access to producers. So, meeting people working at NGOs and governments were the ones who put me in touch with people for my graduate school work, also for my work after that, helped me earn people's trust, which is especially important when you're talking about financial information. And hopefully through this access and this information we were able to provide, achieve some impact. And it was also really critical for getting feedback on and improving the green value tool over the years that we worked with it. I definitely benefited from the legacy of Marianne and Karen, as well as other UF graduate students who had worked before me in Acre, especially Samantha Stone and Rich Wallace. When I began my master's work, this was really important, and their reputations and introductions were invaluable in opening doors to different NGOs and government agencies. And this was the foundation that I was able to build on for creating a network that I needed to be able to implement this work across the region. So just wanted to add that, my appreciation for that and the importance of collaboration in my work. And with that, happy to take any questions, and just wanted to, well, I guess I should quickly acknowledge that USAID and US Forest Service were really key in providing support from the time of my PhD work all the way through last year, and I continue to be in touch with them and talking about new opportunities for collaboration. The first FLAIR conference provided a travel grant and small sum with funding from World Bank to help me work on the Coomflona article in World Development. Earth Innovation Institute is where I was based. I'm very grateful to Coomflona and Chico Mendez and all the different collaborators you see down below here that were the 11 NGOs I worked most closely with for the 5 years I was at Earth Innovation. So thanks.